My mother swapped my spot at Grandma's 80th Gala to let the golden child take credit for my 3-month project until the raw, unedited archive loaded on the big screen. My mother spent her entire adult life treating my younger sister like a rare, delicate glass sculpture while treating me like the sturdy, invisible wooden floorboards beneath it. For 26 years, I lived in a household where my achievements were viewed as basic duties, while my sister's bare minimum efforts were celebrated with the intensity of a national holiday. But last weekend, her obsession with her golden child completely backfired, and it blew up our entire extended family in front of 50 people because she didn't realize that a raw, unedited history cannot be controlled by a printed script. I am the eldest daughter, Paige, and my sister is Alana. If you grew up as the designated functional child in a family run by an enabler, you already know the exact psychological architecture of our home. Alana is 23, completely unemployed, lives in our mother's furnished basement rent-free, and spends her days managing an aesthetic social media feed that projects a lifestyle of wealthy, creative leisure. According to our mother, Vivian, Alana is a highly attuned, artistic spirit who simply cannot be weighed down by the crude, practical realities of a standard 9-to-5 job. I, on the other hand, work 45 hours a week as a professional digital archivist and restoration specialist for regional historical societies. Because I pay my own bills, maintain a quiet apartment across town, and do not cause emotional emergencies every Tuesday night, Vivian treats me like a corporate utility provider. I am someone she calls only when her printer stops communicating with her laptop, when her gutters need a local contractor recommendation, or when an extended family gathering requires heavy lifting. For years, I accepted this dynamic out of an exhausting sense of survival. I leaned into my work, finding solace in the quiet, predictable laws of preservation. In my laboratory, old film negatives, crumbling ink, and faded paper reacted precisely to the chemical stabilizers I applied. They didn't manipulate, they didn't have favorite children, and they didn't rewrite history to protect a favored sibling. The true fracture line in our family began 3 months ago, during a rare Sunday dinner that I was summoned to attend. The entire extended household was preparing for the upcoming 80th birthday celebration of my maternal grandmother, Meredith. Meredith is the absolute anchor of our family tree, a sharp, fiercely independent woman who spent 40 years working as a rural community nurse before retiring to her small farmhouse on the outskirts of the county. Unlike Vivian, Meredith never bought into the myth of Alana's fragile brilliance. She valued hard work, quiet integrity, and deep memory. Because Meredith's milestone birthday was approaching, the extended aunts, uncles, and cousins, totaling over 50 people from 4 different states, were flying into the valley for a formal gala dinner at the historic community center plaza. During that Sunday dinner, Vivian announced that the celebration required a monumental centerpiece. "It needs to be an emotional journey," Vivian had said, her eyes tracking Alana, who was lazily separating microgreens on her porcelain plate with a silver fork. "We need a visual masterpiece that shows the world the true depth of Meredith's legacy, something poetic." I watched Alana sigh, adjusting her designer cashmere cardigan, a piece that had been charged directly to Vivian's credit card the previous afternoon. "I would love to curate it," Alana murmured, her voice dripping with artificial exhaustion. "But my creative energy is just so depleted from my current lifestyle portfolio project." Vivian immediately turned her sharp, demanding gaze toward me. "Paige, you have the technical scanners. You will gather the family records and handle the production work. Alana will provide the creative oversight." That was the moment the project was dumped into my lap. I knew exactly what creative oversight meant. It meant Alana would sleep until noon while I spent my weekends driving hundreds of miles to the homes of elderly great aunts, pulling dusty cardboard boxes out of damp crawl spaces, and handling fragile media that hadn't seen the light of day since 1974. I didn't mind the labor because I loved Meredith. For 12 consecutive weekends, I turned my small apartment into a dedicated preservation laboratory. I carefully cleaned layers of yellowed Scotch tape off historic portraits, ran degraded 35mm slides through high-resolution drum scanners, and frame by frame restored old home movies that had begun to suffer from vinegar syndrome. I didn't just throw together a basic digital slideshow. I built a physical and digital masterpiece. I constructed a massive 6-foot-wide physical memory wall made of reclaimed barnwood, complete with hand-tinted archival prints attached by brass historical clips. Digitally, I spent late nights organizing over 700 restored images into a flawless chronological timeline, balancing the audio levels of Meredith's favorite mid-century jazz records to serve as the atmospheric soundtrack. I spent over $800 of my own personal savings on specialized museum-grade matte paper, archival ink cartridges, and professional structural mounting boards. Whenever I texted the family group chat to ask Alana for help verifying the names of distant cousins in a 1982 group photograph, she would leave the message on read for 3 days before replying with a single sentence. My migraines have been so intense lately. Paige, just use your best judgment. The morning of the gala arrived, crisp and clear. I woke up at 5 in the morning, loaded my sedan until the rear suspension sagged under the weight of the wooden display panels, and arrived at the community center plaza exactly 3 hours before the official vendor setup time. My hands were raw from lifting the heavy timber frames, and my back ached from standing on a metal stepladder to align the overhead projector lenses. I spent hours tuning the aspect ratio, taping down the thick, heavy-gauge extension cords along the carpeted aisles, and wiping every speck of dust off the glass display cases I had rented to house Meredith's vintage nursing medals. By 11 in the morning, the hall looked breathtaking. The history of an extraordinary woman was laid out with the precision of a National Gallery exhibit. At noon, 1 hour before the first wave of extended family members was scheduled to arrive, the heavy double doors of the hall swung open. My mother walked in, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood perimeter. Behind her walked Alana, wearing a pristine, custom-tailored emerald silk dress that cost more than my monthly rent payment. She was holding an iced matcha latte, her eyes scanning my completed work with a cold, analytical detachment. Vivienne stopped dead in the center of the room, looking at the massive wooden memory wall and the glowing, crisp projection screen. A slow, calculating smile spread across her face. She didn't look at me, even though I was standing there in sweatpants covered in wood dust, with a roll of gaffer tape hanging from my belt. She turned directly to Alana, her voice rising into that breathless, theatrical cadence she reserved exclusively for her golden child. "Oh, sweetie, look at this. This is going to look absolutely magnificent when you present it to the county judges and the family. This is exactly the kind of high-profile cultural leadership exposure your resume needs for that civic board nomination next month." My heart plummeted into my stomach. I stepped down from the technical platform, the roll of tape clattering against the metal railing. "Mom, what are you talking about? Alana isn't presenting this. I've spent 3 months building this entire project from scratch. My name is on the official program as the historical coordinator." Vivian's smile vanished instantly, her expression hardening into the cold, clinical contempt she used whenever I forgot my place as the functional servant. She stepped into my personal space, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper so Alana wouldn't have to hear the unpleasantness. "Don't start your typical safe drama today of all days, Paige," she hissed, her eyes glaring toward the entryway. "You are far too clinical, dry, and technical to stand on that stage. You'll turn a beautiful family milestone into a boring college lecture." Alana has a natural, poetic, emotional resonance. It will mean so much more to Meredith to see her youngest granddaughter hosting the tribute. Besides, you already have a career. Alana needs the spotlight to establish her civic profile. You will sit in the rear technical booth, manage the audio console, and let your sister lead. Alana didn't say a word. She simply stood behind our mother, tilted her head back, and took a slow sip of her drink, throwing me a smug, triumphant little smile over the rim of her plastic cup. Vivian stepped forward, reached out, and violently snatched the heavy brass presentation clicker right out of my hand, shoving it into Alana's silk-pocketed dress. "Go change into your formal dress, Paige," my mother ordered, turning her back to me. "The real guests are about to arrive." I walked out of the main hall and into the small, concrete technical storage room behind the kitchen to change into my formal clothes. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely zip up my dark navy dress. The sheer, suffocating injustice of the moment felt like a physical weight in my chest. For years, I had allowed them to take small things: my time, my energy, my boundaries. But this was 3 months of my soul, poured into a tribute for the one person in the family who truly saw me. I stood in the dim light of the storage room, looking at my reflection in a cracked vanity mirror, and felt something fundamental snap inside my mind. The old compliance, the trauma-induced desire to keep the peace at all costs, simply dissolved. I realized a critical truth about the dynamic between my mother and sister. Their entire system relied on my absolute efficiency. They stole my work because they knew my work was flawless. They assumed that because I was the responsible one, I would protect the family's public image from failure, even if it meant absorbing their behavior in silence. They believed I would manage the technical console perfectly from the back of the room to ensure Alana's stolen triumph went off without a single glitch. But as I walked out of the storage room and ascended the metal spiral stairs to the elevated technical sound booth at the back of the auditorium, a cold, calculating calm took over. I sat down behind the massive, multi-channel digital audio-visual console and looked down at the main floor. The doors had opened, and 55 members of our extended family were streaming into the hall. Uncles in tweed jackets, great-aunts with pearl necklaces, and cousins I hadn't seen since high school were mingling around the physical memory board. In the center of it all sat Meredith, looking radiant in a lavender lace gown, her sharp blue eyes taking in the room with quiet appreciation. My mother was already moving through the crowd like a high society politician, loudly directing everyone's attention toward the main stage. I heard her voice echoing through the auxiliary floor monitors. Yes, we are so incredibly proud. Our sweet Alana poured her entire soul into this project for her grandmother. She worked through so much personal exhaustion to preserve these memories. I looked down at the primary hard drive plugged into the master media console. On it were two distinct directories. The first was labeled Curated Edit Final. That was the folder I had spent months meticulously filtering. It contained only the most beautiful, pristine, and unified moments of Meredith's life, the edited version of history that protected the family from its own internal rot. The second directory was labeled Raw Archival Master Backup. When I had cleared out the attic of my great-aunt's abandoned lake house to gather materials, I had discovered an old, unindexed shoebox labeled 1998 2005 digital roll. It contained the very first generations of raw digital camera memory cards and old unedited home videotapes from our childhood. I had digitized every single file in that box for the sake of completeness, intending to sort through them later. When I actually viewed the footage, I was struck by what I found. It was a time capsule of absolute, unedited entitlement. I had hidden those raw files away in the backup folder, intending to bury them forever to keep the peace. I looked down at the stage. Alana was standing by the podium, practicing her poses under the warm amber spotlights, completely unbothered by her own choice to take credit for another's work. Because Alana was profoundly lazy, she had refused to attend the mandatory technical dress rehearsal the night before. She hadn't previewed a single slide on the actual display server. She hadn't checked the file sequencing. She hadn't verified the media links. And she had completely refused to read the detailed archival logbook I had left on the podium. She genuinely believed that historical presentation work was nothing more than clicking a button and reading generic, emotional platitudes off the printed tablet script my mother had hastily typed up for her in the car. They completely relied on my perfectionism to shield them from their own lack of preparation. They believed that even if they pushed me into the dark, I would still work flawlessly in the shadows to make sure they looked magnificent. My fingers hovered over the master control interface. With a steady, deliberate movement, I unlinked the Curated Edit Final directory from the automated playback loop. In its place, I mapped the master video queue system directly to the raw, archival master backup folder. I disabled the soft fade transitions and turned off the automated content filters that I had spent weeks programming to hide background noise. I left the master volume gain for the podium microphone wide open, ensuring that every single breath, hesitation, and off-script murmur from the stage would project with absolute clarity through the high-end venue speaker array. I sat back in my leather chair, my heart rate stabilizing into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The lights in the main auditorium began to drop, signaling the start of the formal presentation. A hushed silence fell over the 55 guests below. My mother took the microphone at the floor level, her face beaming under the house lights as she addressed the crowd. "Family, friends, and distinguished guests," Vivian announced, her voice echoing beautifully through the room. "We are gathered here to honor the incredible 80-year journey of our matriarch, Meredith. While many of us have contributed our love, one member of our family took it upon herself to spend months in the trenches of our history, sacrificing her time and her creative spirit to build a masterpiece for her grandmother. Please welcome your host for the evening, my beautiful youngest daughter, Alana." The room erupted into warm, enthusiastic applause. My uncles cheered, my aunts clapped their hands, and Meredith smiled softly from the head table. Alana stepped up to the podium, her emerald silk dress shimmering under the high-intensity spotlights. She adjusted the microphone with a practiced, theatrical elegance, took a deep breath, and prepared to take credit for my life's work. "Thank you so much, everyone," Alana murmured into the microphone, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "When I began this intense archival journey 3 months ago, I asked myself, how do you capture the soul of a woman as grand as our grandmother? It took endless nights of sorting through dusty boxes, balancing old media, and sacrificing my own health, but I did it all for you, Grandma." She reached into her pocket, pulled out the heavy brass presentation clicker, and proudly pressed the button to launch the first chapter of the timeline. On the massive 15-foot-wide projection screen behind her, the system pulled the first file from the raw backup directory. It was a stunning, high-resolution restoration of Meredith in 1965, standing in her crisp white nurse's uniform outside the county clinic. The image was flawless, the colors perfectly balanced by my weeks of painstaking color grading work. The crowd let out a collective soft murmur, charmed by the beauty of the image. Alana smiled arrogantly, her shoulders dropping as she realized realized how easy this was going to be, she didn't even look back at the screen. She just glanced down at her tablet script and read the text I had compiled. Meredith spent her youth serving others, always putting the community before herself, Alana read smoothly. She clicked the button for the next slide, completely confident that the rest of the presentation would be an effortless ride to a standing ovation. But the raw archival directory didn't have a curated sequence. It followed the unedited, brutal timeline of our real lives. And as the next file loaded onto the media server, the atmosphere in the community plaza changed instantly. The second slide didn't show a historical milestone. It was a raw, uncompressed digital video file from December 2002, recorded on an early generation handheld camcorder during our family's old Christmas gathering at Meredith's farmhouse. The video opened with a sharp, loud audio hiss that cut through the auditorium speakers. On the giant screen, a 12-year-old Alana was captured in high definition, standing in Meredith's kitchen. She was throwing a massive, screaming temper tantrum because Meredith had gifted her a beautiful, hand-knit wool blanket that she had spent 6 months creating. On the tape, Alana's young voice shrieked with absolute clarity through the hall speakers. "I don't want this ugly, scratchy garbage. It smells like an old person's house." The video showed her violently snatching the blanket, marching out the back door, and throwing the handmade heirloom directly into a muddy metal trash bin in the yard, while Meredith stood in the background of the frame, her face dropping in quiet, crushed humiliation. The entire auditorium went dead, suffocatingly silent. The clinking of wine glasses stopped instantly. My aunts froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. My mother, who had been beaming in the front row, went completely rigid, her face draining of all color. Alana, still standing at the podium, didn't realize what was behind her until she heard the loud, screeching audio of her own childhood tantrum echoing through the professional sound system. She whipped her head around, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she stared at her 12-year-old self trashing her grandmother's gift on a 15-foot display. Panicking, Alana slammed her thumb down on the brass clicker to force the system to the next slide. But because the raw directory was an unedited sequence of that specific digital roll, the next file loaded instantly. It was a scanned, high-resolution image of a diary page from a vintage school notebook that I had found inside that same shoebox. The handwriting was unmistakably Alana's teenage scrawl, written in giant, angry purple marker. The text was projected so large that even the relatives at the very back of the hall could read every single word. "Mom says we have to go to Meredith's house again for Thanksgiving. I hate it there. It smells like old medicine and she's boring. I'm going to pretend I have a stomach flu so I can stay home and go to the mall instead. Mom said she'll lie to Meredith for me so I don't have to go." A collective, sharp gasp echoed through the room. My great-aunt Evelyn let out a loud, horrified gasp. The cousins began whispering frantically to each other, their heads turning toward my mother, who was now trembling with a mixture of rage and confusion. Alana's face turned a violent, terrifying shade of crimson under the warm stage spotlights. Her poetic, professional composure completely dissolved. She started slamming her thumb onto the clicker over and over again, her breathing ragged and audible through the open microphone. "Next, next! Turn it off! The system is glitched!" she screamed into the mic, her voice cracking under the pressure. But the media server simply processed every click by pulling the next sequential file from the raw master directory. The screen flashed, and a high-resolution video file from Thanksgiving 2008 appeared. The video showed the interior of Meredith's bedroom. A teenage Alana was caught completely red-handed on camera, quietly creeping into the room while the rest of the family was downstairs, opening Meredith's vintage leather purse, and pocketing a crisp $100 bill that Meredith had set aside for the local charity drive. The video clearly showed Alana looking directly at the camera with a smug, defiant smirk before slipping out of the room. This specific incident had caused a brutal, multi-year feud within the family, during which my mother had violently accused one of my younger male cousins of being dishonest, destroying his relationship with the family for nearly a decade. The proof was now projected 15 feet wide, absolute and undeniable, in front of 55 extended family members. The cousin who had been falsely accused, Luke, stood up from his table, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling finger at the stage. "I knew it," he shouted, his voice thick with years of accumulated resentment. "You spent 10 years telling everyone I took that money, Vivian. You ruined my relationship with Grandma." The hall erupted into absolute chaos. Uncles were standing up, shouting questions. Aunts were covering their mouths in shock. My mother scrambled out of her front row seat, knocking over her red wine glass, which shattered against the white linen tablecloth. She ran toward the stage like a madwoman, trying to use her physical body to block the projector lens, waving her arms wildly in the beam of light. "Turn it off! Someone turn it off! Paige, shut down the console!" Vivian screamed toward the technical booth, her eyes locking onto me in the shadows. Alana was completely frozen at the podium, tears of pure humiliation streaming down her face, her emerald silk dress looking completely out of place under the flashing lights of her own exposed history. She dropped the microphone, and the heavy metal stand clattered against the stage floor with a deafening, booming echo. I sat quietly in the technical sound booth for exactly 5 seconds, allowing the absolute weight of the truth to settle over the room. I watched my mother and sister face the reality they had spent decades trying to erase. Then I leaned forward, my fingers moving across the digital console with calm, absolute precision. I unmapped the raw archival directory. With one keystroke, I loaded the curated edit final master video, the beautiful, heartfelt tribute video that I had produced with my own hands. I hit the master override switch on my phone console, activating the secondary stage lighting, and stepped out of the dark technical booth. I walked down the metal spiral staircase, my heels clicking softly in the sudden, expectant silence of the room. I walked straight down the center aisle, passing my mother, who was still standing frozen in the projector beam, and stepped onto the stage. I picked up the fallen microphone, adjusted the stand, and looked directly at Meredith, who was sitting quietly at her table, her sharp blue eyes looking directly into mine. I didn't look at Alana, who was currently fleeing the stage toward the backstage exit, sobbing into her hands. I didn't acknowledge my mother, who was slowly sinking into an empty chair, realizing her social standing in the family was permanently shattered. I cleared my throat, my voice projecting with steady, calm, and absolute authority through the venue. "Good afternoon, family," I said softly. "History is a delicate thing. If you don't take care of the truth, it has a way of forcing its own alignment. 3 months ago, I set out to preserve the real legacy of our grandmother, Meredith. Not because she is perfect, but because her real life, her real work, her real sacrifices for this community is worth more than any manufactured story." I clicked the secondary remote control in my pocket. The screen behind me filled with a stunning, gorgeous montage of Meredith's life, her actual work, her true friends, and 30 years of genuine, happy milestones with the extended family members who actually loved her. I delivered my original, deep historical presentation completely from memory, explaining the context of every old photograph and honoring the real spirit of the woman who raised me. By the end of the 20-minute presentation, the entire hall was in tears of genuine emotion. The aunts, uncles, and cousins stood up in a massive, thunderous standing ovation that lasted for nearly 3 minutes. Meredith stood up from her table, walked slowly up the stage steps, and wrapped her arms around me in a tight, fierce embrace. "Thank you, Paige," she whispered directly into my ear. "Thank you for always being the one who remembers the truth." When the house lights came up for the formal dinner, the front row head table was completely empty. Alana had locked herself in the venue's private lounge bathroom, refusing to come out, and my mother had quietly fled the building before the main course was even served. No one asked about them. For the rest of the evening, my family surrounded my table, pouring me wine, thanking me for clearing old wounds and celebrating the history we had finally reclaimed. My mother and sister haven't sent me a single text message since last weekend, and in the quiet, beautiful silence of my archive, I finally found my peace.